Welcome to the lecture about executive power and its limits, Nixon and Youngstown. Alright everyone, today we're going to dive into two landmark Supreme Court cases that define the limits of presidential power in the United States. United States v. Nixon from 1974 and Youngstown Sheet and Tube Comer v. Sawyer from 1952. Both cases are fascinating because they deal with moments in history where a president faced off against another branch of government, and the court had to decide just how far executive power really goes. Let's start with United States versus Nixon. Picture the early 1970s. The country is in political turmoil over what we now know as the Watergate scandal. In June of 1972, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex. Over time, investigators discovered links between the burglars and President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. As the investigation heated up, a special prosecutor named Archibald Cox demanded certain audio recordings of conversations Nixon had held in the Oval Office. These tapes were believed to contain important evidence, but Nixon refused to turn them over. He claimed something called executive privilege, saying that a president must be able to keep some communications secret in order to do the job effectively, especially to protect national security and to encourage frank advice from advisors. So the legal question became, can a president claim absolute executive privilege to avoid turning over evidence in a criminal case? Nixon argued that the courts couldn't even review his claim because that would violate the separation of powers. But the special prosecutor insisted that in a criminal investigation, no one, not even the president, should be above the law. The decision. In an 8-0 decision, Justice Rehnquist didn't participate. The Supreme Court ruled against Nixon. The justices agreed that executive privilege exists, but they made it crystal clear it's not absolute. In a criminal investigation, the need for evidence can outweigh the president's interest in confidentiality, and the president must comply with judicial orders. Chief Justice Warren Burger summed it up powerfully when he said, "Neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the generalized need for confidentiality of high-level communications can sustain an absolute unqualified presidential privilege." In other words, the president is not above the law. Nixon turned over the tapes. Within weeks, he resigned, becoming the only U.S. president to do so. Now, let's step back in time to 1952 for Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer. This case happened during the Korean War. Steel production was absolutely essential for weapons, vehicles, and other war materials. But a massive steelworkers' strike was looming. President Harry Truman feared the strike would cripple the war effort. Instead of asking Congress for special authority, Truman ordered his Secretary of Commerce, Charles Sawyer, to seize and operate most of the nation's steel mills to keep production going. The legal question. Could the president seize private property without explicit congressional authorization? Truman said yes, claiming that his inherent presidential powers, especially as commander-in-chief during wartime, gave him that authority. The steel companies strongly disagreed, saying this was a clear case of presidential overreach. The decision. In a 6-3 decision, the court ruled against Truman. They said the president cannot seize private property without constitutional or legislative authority. His role as commander-in-chief did not extend to taking control of domestic industries that were not directly part of military operations. Justice Robert Jackson wrote a famous concurring opinion that gave us a framework still used today to think about presidential power. He said there are 3 situations. First, when the president acts with Congress's approval, his power is at its maximum. Second, when Congress is silent, there's a zone of twilight where power is uncertain. And third, when the president acts against the will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb. That's where Truman was, acting without, and even contrary to, congressional intent, bringing them together. When we compare these two cases, the message is clear. In United States versus Nixon, the court told us that a president cannot use executive privilege to shield criminal evidence. In Youngstown, the court told us that a president cannot seize private industry without the backing of Congress or the Constitution. Both reinforce the same core principles. The president's power is significant but not unlimited. The United States is built on a system of checks and balances where no single branch can dominate, and the president, like every citizen, is subject to the law. Closing. So what do we take away? These cases remind us that emergencies, political crises, and even national security concerns do not give the president a blank check. The Supreme Court stands as a crucial check, ensuring that the separation of powers remains intact and that we continue to live under a government of laws, not of men. And with that, I'll leave you with some questions. Should executive privilege have strict limits? Could Truman have handled the steel strike in a constitutional way? And, given the political climate today, do you think the court would decide these cases the same way now?